Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Welcome to the launch of the Chatham House report on myths and misconceptions around Russian military intent. You should be listening to Keir Giles right now. He is the co-editor of this report, and I think he's stuck in passport control in Heathrow somewhere, possibly listening in. I'm not entirely sure. So thank you, Keir, for this. Also, thank you everybody really, because for bearing with us. This was rescheduled from the 19th of September, last Monday, Her Majesty the Queen's funeral. So thanks to Anna in particular, Anna Morgan, for managing the rescheduling. And of course, the speakers here today, who I'll introduce in a second, for their remarkable flexibility and patience. Now, as you may know, the paper and the topic we're discussing today had a kind of an ancestor. We looked at the much broader Western policy debate and the myths that propagated that back in May 2021. And this is a follow-on, it's a successor, it's considerably more focused. I suppose you might say more topical, considering the damage the Russian military is continuing to inflict upon Ukraine, even while it gets a taste of its own medicine, of course. And that is true, it's more topical, but I ought to make it clear that this paper and the discussion today is not really about the current operational and tactical issues in Russia's war on Ukraine. Instead, it's about the longer term, systemic and conceptual issues concerning how Russia thinks about going to war and what it might mean for us and for NATO. Because I suppose, as Keir told me, in fact, this won't be the last war. Russia will always be, there'll be more, and Russia will still be there. So the aim of this project, just like the previous myths and misconceptions paper, was to save us all having these sort of exact same conversations over and over again, stop people repeating these misconceptions and having a handy reference point for people instead. I think there's a link on the website for those who haven't read it. Perhaps many of you have. It's been out on the website for a couple of weeks now. And we have brought along a number of the authors to introduce their pieces, their chapters, as well as a respondent at the end. Present and in order of speaking will be Valery Akimenko, a colleague of Keir's actually at the Conflict Studies Research Center, a senior analyst there, colleague of ours, in fact, as well, talking about Russia's nuclear threshold, if you will. Richard Connolly, longtime academic, but now director of Eastern Advisory Group, will talk about whether Russia can afford to carry on financing its military. This one may be in flux, so I'll look forward to seeing if this has changed a little bit since Richard wrote his piece. Professor Katarzyna Zysk is Professor of International Relations at the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies, and she will be deconstructing the myth that what Russia is doing in the Arctic is purely defensive. Of course, it's not. Alexander Lanoshka is Assistant Professor of International Relations at the University of Waterloo, and he'll be talking about the Suwałki Gap and why we shouldn't take as much notice of it, even if probably people will start thinking about it again shortly. And Oscar Jonsson will be talking about the fact that there's no such thing as grey zone warfare. It's just warfare, really, in a manner that we've chosen to ignore, of course. So thank you for that, Oscar. And then finally, last but not least, Dara Masikot, senior policy analyst at RAND in Washington, will offer sort of a respondent's comments and her thoughts on the paper and some comments thereof. So thank you very much indeed to all of you in advance. I will just say, I think I should very briefly talk about the rest of the paper. Obviously, I mentioned Keir as co-editor. There's also Mathieu Bouleg, formerly of the Russia-Eurasia program, now in the United States. So they did all of the work really on this, on bringing it all together. And there's also, just to go down the authors very briefly, Kalev Stoichescu, talking about why Article 5 is potentially worthless if Russia decides to attack a NATO state. NATO states, in other words, are not safe from attack in a sense. Andre Kendall Taylor from the US again exposes the myth that Russia just attacks other countries when it needs a domestic distraction. That's clearly not the case here. Robin Hagblum exposes the myth of the supposedly impenetrable barrier of Russia's A2AD bubbles, if you like. Christian Van Brusgaard talks about how Russia doesn't do escalate to de-escalate. Obviously, that's very topical right now. And Margarita Klein shows that Russia and China aren't joining forces against the West militarily. So that's all for your delectation if you wish to click on that link or if you have seen it already. So thank you all again for contributing to the project, and Dara for contributing to this seminar. And afterwards, after the authors have spoken just for 3, 4, 5 minutes on their topics, then we'll just have some Q&A. We'll go on for an hour and a half. I will read them out, so just put them into the Q&A, please, not the chat, for Q&A. And again, I would just ask you, please, ladies and gents, not to ask questions that are about today, about the referenda, about what's going on the ground in Ukraine right now, and stick to the topic as prescribed here. I'm also conscious that Richard and Valeria only have sort of an hour with us, so I might sort of try to bring most of the questions to them to begin with, and then pass it on, up to a point anyway. And finally, of course, we're on the record here. This is a launch after all, and we're recording it. We should, if all goes well, post it at a later date. So that's basically it. Hope that's reasonably clear. Thanks once again. And I said, Valeria, I think we'll start with you, if we may.
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you, James. To restate the myth my particular chapter addresses, it is that Russia's nuclear threats are real and should be taken literally, as distinct from actual military intent. One of the first points that the chapter raises is that Russia's nuclear rhetoric is incessant and personally abhorrent. For the most part, it's consumed domestically. On occasion, quite frequently, it makes its way abroad. We all know, for example, what Vladimir Putin said on September the 21st in his mobilization speech, that he will take every action necessary to defend Russia against the threats to its territorial integrity by all means available. In a way, a veiled nuclear threat for you. He also invoked the word nuclear in the same passage. That's just one example. Other examples I could mention just over the past couple of weeks, it must be said, are, for example, his number 2 on the Security Council and himself, former President and Prime Minister, Dmitry Medvedev, who just the other day published a piece which reserved Russia's right to deliver a nuclear strike against Ukraine, and furthermore argued that no response by NATO would follow. Yet another example I could mention recently is an article by Fyodor Lukyanov, the editor-in-chief of the magazine Russia and Global Affairs, who, in an interview with a fellow Russian propaganda grandmaster, said that in his view, what should take place is the return of what he described as the fear factor, notably in relations between the United States and Russia, and once again, the nuclear reference therein was quite pronounced. So once again, a thinly veiled nuclear replication of a standoff between the United States and Russia. Domestically, this kind of rhetoric is virtually a daily affair. Once again, to quote an example from recent days, on 2 occasions, on 2 consecutive days, on September the 18th and 19th, if memory serves, a Russian MP and former general by the name of Gorlov twice made statements which could easily be interpreted as nuclear threats in relation to the United Kingdom. In another example, literally a day or 2 later, we had an interview with yet another Russian chap by the name of Sergei Markov, who in an interview with BBC's Radio 4 Today program apparently ranted more or less along the same lines. To read out a headline from one of the British reaction pieces, screaming former Putin advisor warns President Putin is ready to nuke Britain if it continues to be an aggressor. Now, I haven't had the pleasure to listen to that interview, but I think this headline says it all. I could go on, but I think that is enough to illustrate the point about the incessant nature of Russia's nuclear rhetoric. The second and perhaps the main point that the paper seeks to address or seeks to make is that perhaps it goes even without saying that the persistent nature of these threats notwithstanding, or even given their persistent nature, they must really be viewed for what they are, primarily a political weapon rather than actual intent to nuke the United Kingdom, the United States, Poland, Western Ukraine, and so forth. Primarily a political weapon designed on the one hand to, for want of a better word, induce paralysis within NATO and broadly the West on the one hand, but on the other to allow Russia to increase its own operational latitude as it seeks to do whatever it seeks to do in Ukraine, elsewhere. We must also point out that these threats do not really amount to doctrinal Russian nuclear policy. Russian nuclear doctrine, in fact, is quite specific. We probably all know the four main preconditions for Russia to consider going nuclear. Number one is launching warning when Russia is under ballistic missile attack. Number two is WMD attack against the Russian Federation or allies. Number three is an attack against critical government and military infrastructure in such a way that it might endanger Russia's own nuclear capability. And number four is a conventional act of aggression against the Russian Federation or its allies in such a way that it endangers the very existence of the state. So that is the set of four criteria, quite narrow, some say quite broad, that delineate Russia's potential nuclear response. And if we recall Putin's September the 21st speech, it referred to none of the above, yet also spoke, as I have mentioned, about threats to Russia's territorial integrity, which Russia will use all available means to defend against. Now, that could be viewed, I suppose, as making up nuclear policy on the hoof or broadening the doctrine, but the doctrine is quite specific and, in fact, does not really say anything about territorial integrity. The text is in front of me, and whereas that document from June 2020, the fundamentals of Russia's nuclear policy, does mention the word territorial integrity, it's limited to its preamble, and that is it. That is the only mention of that notion in the nuclear doctrine. To move on, there are several other ways which the paper raises, or which the paper mentions, which would militate against Russia's actual intent to go nuclear at well, this particular stage, shall I say. One of them is that Russia's conventional capabilities have improved. They have been put under severe test in Ukraine, but they have improved, which in a way would suggest that Russia would rely on those rather than at the drop of a hat. Yes, there is another point that the paper also mentions, and that is that Russia's nuclear doctrine, limited as it is also open to interpretation. So, for example, although it speaks of the purely defensive nature of Russia's nuclear policy, some argue that, for example, even the campaign such as in Ukraine could be proclaimed by Russia to be defensive and thus potentially open itself to nuclear use. The paper further says that that is not to say that there is no danger which would precipitate Russian nuclear use, and well, it goes over several factors. One of which perhaps is that Russia's nuclear arsenal has been prioritized for renewal, diversification, and to some extent enlargement, especially in the category of non-strategic nuclear weapons, a category that is unverified and for the moment unverifiable because it's outside the remit of any, well, of the only nuclear arms limitation accord in action in place at the moment, the START Treaty, the new START Treaty, things like that. And finally, the paper proposes several ways in which these concerns, for their concerns, could be addressed. One of which is, for example, to attempt to close a capability gap between Russia with its stockpile of non-strategic nuclear weapons and NATO, and several other ways which could be summed up perhaps by, if I may coin the phrase, the attitude of keeping calm and carrying on. And the paper suggests several ways in which we could all keep calm and carry on. And with that, James, I think I would like to hand over to you, but not before, by way of acknowledgement, sorry, one other thing, I would like to thank everyone involved in the production of this paper, everyone at Chatham House, everyone everywhere, editors, peer reviewers, but especially K. Giles, with whom I have discussed this subject extensively, and which is reflected to some extent in the paper as you see it today.
Okay. Thanks very much indeed, Valeri. That was great. It reminds me of something I heard recently, your topic, whereby if Russia threatens it, it probably won't do it, whereas Russia, if it denies it, it probably will. Seems to be sort of the short version of what you're saying. But I think we need to go into that a little bit more detail later, perhaps, to see into what value do we place on doctrine versus rhetoric. And I think there's some you can drill into that. Now, Richard, can Russia continue to afford it? Over to you.
Thanks, James, and hello, everybody. Apologies if I sound a bit rough. I'm recovering from a cold. So the myth that I addressed was that Russia doesn't spend as much on its military as some think it does, and that it can't sustain this, principally due to economic weakness. And in the short paper, I argue that Russia has done, in fact, a very good job of spending a lot on its military over the course of the last decade, and in fact, even going back further than that, even when the economy has been doing badly. So if we look at Russia's military expenditure, taking together all the different ways of counting it that are publicly acknowledged in Russian budgetary data by Russian officials, then you can see that Russia spent between 3.5% and 5.5% of GDP on its military, really since the collapse of the Soviet Union. So even in the 1990s, when Russia was economically at its weakest, it still managed to spend around about 3.5% of GDP on its military, which if you compare that with some of the struggles that NATO members have had over the last decade or two, or indeed even three, going back to the end of the Cold War, we struggle sometimes to spend 2% of GDP. Russia, at its economically speaking weakest, still managed to spend 3.5%. In fact, over the last decade, because it underwent a process of military modernization following its poor performance in the Georgia War back in 2008, military expenditure peaked in about 2015, 2016 at closer to 6% of GDP. So Russia does spend a lot on its military compared to its neighbors in NATO, compared to China, even to the extent that Chinese figures don't probably reveal what's really happening. And even compared to the United States, which is the most militarized of the major powers in the world. And this is the figures that I've just cited are from official data. I think these official data are understated. There's plenty of evidence that I won't go into now for time constraints to suggest that Russia spends even more than it officially states that it does. There's plenty of hidden spending in its state armament program and arms procurement. And there's lots of ways, lots of other parts of the budget that are kept secret, which not all of that will go on the military, but a lot will. And the reasons for this willingness to spend a lot on its military are long-standing, and in my opinion, built into the fabric of the system of political economy. It goes back to the Soviet period and even before that. Imperial Russia, the Soviet Union, and modern Russia have always spent a lot as a proportion of output. And this means that military expenditure is always the priority above other areas of social and economic expenditure in Russia. And as I say, this is true when the economy isn't doing well. So this military modernization program that I mentioned took place over the course of the last decade or so. This was a period when the Russian economy, after a period of rapid growth between 1999 and 2008, then really entered this period that's still in a stagnation. So as the economy was stagnant, military expenditure rose sharply. So that's the point that I make. And it's important because the myth that I often hear, certainly amongst commentators and sometimes policymakers, is, well, Russia might be spending a lot now, but it can't keep this up because its economy is weak. And whilst it's true the economy is pretty weak, although not sometimes as weak as people make out, but it isn't by any stretch doing fantastically, and hasn't done over the last decade. Nevertheless, because military spending and security is prioritized above anything else, the military always ends up receiving a lot of money. That doesn't always translate, by the way, into effectiveness. As we know, a lot of it gets lost in graft and corruption and waste, inefficient allocation of resources, etc. But it spends a lot. If we look to the present day, even just this year, as the economy is getting smaller as a result of sanctions, and I think sanctions do account for a large proportion of why the Russian economy isn't performing well this year, revealed, that is what the Russian government is admitting, military expenditure has already risen by around 1 trillion rubles. This is as the economy is getting, as I say, smaller. How smaller we don't know, and we won't know until the end of the year. And again, I think that the Russian officials are probably understating how much extra they're spending on what is a large-scale and intense war. And so therefore, it seems to me that even though the economy is likely to be hobbled by sanctions going forward, and these sanctions are for the most part going to remain in place, certainly for as long as the war continues in Ukraine. So even though the longer run trajectory for the Russian economy is going to be even bleaker than it was before February of this year, Russia seems intent, and the leadership, the Kremlin, seem intent on allocating more of those dwindling resources on the military. And of course, what this will result in is an acceleration of a trend that has already been underway for the last decade, and that is towards an increasingly high militarization of Russian society. I'll leave it at that and just say that although Russia's military might not be performing as well as people expected it to in Ukraine, that's going to be for myriad factors. But in my assessment as an economist, it's not due to lack of money. And that's unlikely to be the case in the future. They'll keep shoveling more money down this hole at the expense of other areas of Russian expenditure that are desperately in need of state support. I'll leave it at that, James. I'll try to keep it brief.
Yeah, that's actually quite a tantalizing thing to leave it on, though, because I mean, you're an unusual economist, Richard, if I may say so, because most economists will tell you that you don't have the money, and you're saying, yes, it's not quite like that. And I haven't quite understood, and maybe, again, save it up for later, as with Valeri's, my question to Valeri, but it's not quite understanding how it's I mean, if you keep on maxing out your credit cards, eventually it doesn't work, and it seems to me that's kind of what's happening here, and I'm not quite clear on how. I can see how it happens now. Russia's current account balance isn't that bad anyway, but I wonder. I suppose the question is how long is it sustainable for? So I take the point. It'll always find some money. They can get the money from somewhere, but I suppose for how long? Don't answer now, Richard, because I'll come back to you, especially if I don't think any questions, because I can't see in the Q&A any in the Q&A just yet. That's a hint, by the way, ladies and gentlemen. Right, Katarzyna, good to see you. Why do people think that what Russia is doing in the Arctic is purely defensive? Seems self-evident to me. It can't possibly be, but over to you.
Well, yes. Well, I have studied this topic for 15 years, and this has been a recurring theme, perpetuated certainly by the Russian authorities, but also some Russian experts and Western experts, policy circles, that what's happening in the Arctic is either defensive or primarily defensive in nature. And this claim has been often combined with the assertion that basically the increase in the Russian military presence we've seen over this past 15 years in the Arctic is merely a necessary modernization after the decay of the 1990s, and driven also by the need to improve safety, surveillance, constabulary missions, in response to the opening of the Arctic Ocean and the expected increase in human presence in the region, which is, in itself quite rather uncontroversial. But the conclusion often also combined with this argument is that there is basically no need for a significant countermeasures by other Arctic states, and this argument highlights Moscow's cooperative, constructive approaches in the Arctic, which are part of the picture indeed. And present often the region as an exceptional geopolitical space, shielded mostly from spillover effects and crises and conflicts in other parts of the region. So why is it wrong? I think there are several problems with that reasoning. First, it's oversimplification of the actual military development. And it does not, claiming this is primarily defensive or defensive in nature, does not really explain what is happening from the military strategy point of view. As the distinction between offense and defense in the Russian strategic thinking is not that clear cut. This reasoning also omits or underestimates other aspects of the Russian military posture, including, of course, such capabilities as nuclear weapons and non-nuclear strategic capabilities such as long-range precision weapons, the capabilities of the aerospace forces, which, by the way, integrate offensive and defensive capabilities. It also not necessarily totally omits, but underestimates the fact that numerous operations that Russia has conducted in the Arctic over the past 15 years, they were clearly provocative in nature, threatening to neighboring countries. And so, describing this Russian military posture in the Arctic as defensive in nature doesn't really explain much, I think, from that military strategy point of view. But in addition, I think partly the explanation why this focus is skewed in this way is that the Arctic often is treated in the broader discourse as a kind of monolithic space, geographic space. We talk about Russian military in the Arctic without the necessary differentiation, geographic differentiation between various Arctic subregions in Russia. They have a different nature. They are seen from Russian perspective as facing different challenges and threats, and therefore calling for a different set of capabilities on a different timeline. And so, for instance, the main center of gravity for the Russian military investments has remained in the European part of the Arctic, or in the Western Arctic, where Russia sees the challenges and threats as being of an immediate character. And contrary to, for instance, the central and eastern parts of the region, where Russia has also expanded military activity, military presence, but they have focused on capabilities such as early warning radars, coastal defenses. Russia expects that there will be more presence, both civilian and military, but on a in a long-term, larger, like farther away, let's say, in the future. And lastly, the Arctic, and especially the high north, so the European part of the Arctic, is seen as strategically quite closely interconnected with other security spaces in Russian strategic thinking. And Russia has demonstrated that in many ways, including in military exercises, especially the annual military exercises. But also in actual military operation, especially during the annexation of Crimea in 2014, but also during the second invasion of Ukraine this year, where basically the Russian armed forces will be drawn, some of the most capable parts of the Russian forces would be drawn and actually involved in offensive operations in Ukraine. But also, so especially the military exercises have demonstrated that Russia might use, especially the Northern Fleet, the capabilities of the Northern Fleet in supporting horizontal and vertical escalation in a major conflict involving another great power elsewhere. So the misconception is problematic for several reasons. I think part of that is that the fact that it has been used by the Russian authorities to try to limit the foreign military presence in the Arctic and turn the blame around for why we see more military activity in the region, accuse NATO and the United States for being the aggressive party in the Arctic as they strengthen their presence, especially over the past few years in the region, exercised more in response to Russia's policies. So I think this inaccurate assessment or skewed assessment can also provide fuel for disinformation, create artificial divides, including in NATO disagreements on the nature of the challenge we are facing in the region, and therefore also on what the adequate policy responses are, which is also can create a potentially exploitable divide. So I think I will stop here.
Yeah, well, thank you very much indeed, Katarzyna. That's absolutely fascinating, and it really will be interesting to see. This isn't a question, the extent to which Russia's grip on the Arctic, if you like, bearing in mind it has considerable forces there and considerable amount of a coastline there, if nothing else, will lessen as a result of its problems in Ukraine. So let's maybe we can explore that later on. Alexander, so why is everyone so excited about the Suwałki Gap? Over to you.
Thank you very much. And indeed, I'd like to begin by thanking especially Keir and Mathieu for putting together a really terrific group of experts, scholars, and analysts to tackle some of these myths and misconceptions that have been so recurrent over the course of the last 10 or so years. So Mathieu and Keir approached me about December of last year, asking me what I could possibly contribute here. And the one that I did end up choosing was indeed on this notion that the Suwałki Gap, which is the 65-mile-long land border between Lithuania and Poland, represents the soft underbelly, as it were, of the entire Western alliance. That for NATO, this was a uniquely vulnerable spot, one that could be especially dangerous precisely because Russia might have certain incentives to quote unquote close the gap in order to form some sort of a land bridge between the exclave of Kaliningrad and Belarus, typically seen as a mere satellite of Russia with no agency of its own. And so I decided that it would be appropriate to talk about it, but I also feel that from the vantage point of September 2022, the argument that I'm addressing is one that has been made perhaps the most obsolete precisely because of Russia's military performance over the course of the last 7 months. And I'll get into that very briefly towards the end. But basically the myth is that Russia has these incentives to close this gap in some sort of major scale land grab so as to cut off the Baltic countries from continental NATO. After all, it's the only land bridge that connects the two parts of the alliance together. And it is one that has preoccupied many defense analysts. Apparently, it's kept up General Ben Hodges late at night, according to NBC News. There have been a number of arguments, even in the beginning of the special military operation, that this still represented a critical weak point of the Western alliance. And so it's certainly no straw man. And indeed, I don't want to necessarily diminish the importance of it. In fact, the alliance did choose to position two enhanced forward presence battle groups more or less in that area, precisely because of the concerns often raised as regards to the Suwałki Gap. Nevertheless, I do think it is much exaggerated for several reasons. One is that it's not entirely clear why Russia would try to close the gap, as it were, not least because it already has transit rights to move goods and peoples between Belarus and Kaliningrad. Of course, with recent sanctions, that's been put under stress, but in peacetime at least, there was that liberty. And indeed, closing the gap, as it were, would necessitate a clear violation of Article 5. And it's not clear to me why Russia would run the risk of such an overt action against NATO, considering that it could lead to some of the uncontrolled escalation that might indeed be very costly to the Kremlin. Moreover, there's no special features of the area that make it uniquely important on military grounds. I don't want to say necessarily that these are but lines on the map, but in some ways they are but lines on the map. There are no geographical features that would confer any one advantage to either side. It's not like the Fulda Gap of the Cold War, which was this valley through which Soviet and Warsaw Pact forces could pour through in order to take West German and NATO territory. I think that's the wrong analogy, maybe more of a corridor than a gap, but be that as it may, I think arguments about Russia holding at risk this area overlook how NATO itself can hold at risk Russian military assets moving through this particular region. It's going to be extremely contested if Russia were to decide to try to close it. And considering what we have seen over the course of the last 7 months, it's not entirely clear whether Russia can contest this very well. And I said that the myth may be the most obsolete precisely because many elements of the Western military district have suffered high degrees of attrition over the course of the last 7 months. Indeed, the 11th Army Corps based in Kaliningrad has suffered extensive attrition. The 6th Combined Arms Army has also suffered quite considerable attrition. So Russia does not necessarily have the wherewithal to go about some of the scenarios that have often been mooted with respect to the Suwałki Gap. And I always thought that notwithstanding these logistical issues or issues related to fire control and so forth, one potential danger with taking too seriously this particular myth and misconception is that it might lead to a bad military posture that NATO could adopt in the region. Not that NATO, in fact, adopted it, but if you were to really take seriously the Suwałki Gap, it seems like the thing to do is to mass and concentrate a lot of force precisely to prevent its closure. But that in turn could create new vulnerabilities precisely because of Russian precision strike or long-range fires. And indeed, the premium these days, as we've seen all too vividly over the course of the 7 months, is to disperse units to avoid such mass and concentration so as to reduce the vulnerabilities that could come. And indeed, I think the more likely scenarios involving Russian aggression, it's not some sort of major land grab via the Suwałki area, but rather taking outlying towns near some of the borders that local NATO members have with Russia. And I think the Suwałki Gap sort of distracted us from those potential more realistic considerations. However, unlikely those scenarios might be, especially in view of current Russian military developments. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Alexander. It does seem to me that in a way that the myth is almost been beneficial in this respect, because the fact that it's been talked about, and it being talked about seems to mean it's been better. It is better defended as a result of it, and therefore so it's not the weak point that people say it is, but that's partly because of its own prominence in the discourse, if you like, over the last 5 years. But you can disagree with that if you like when I come to you later. Last, in terms of the authors, but not in terms of the speakers, we've got Oscar, who yes, has appeared on my screen. Hi, Oscar, good to see you. This is the most seductive one, it seems to me, because we so easily lapse into talking about grey zone, hybrid, non-kinetic warfare. I do. A lot of my colleagues do. I think it's easy to do. And whilst I intellectually understand, of course, that it is just warfare, it's just so easy to do, because I guess we are inured to thinking about the things that go bang rather than the things that don't, which clearly are warfare, but we just don't want to face up to it. So I do find it seductive in a way in which I am seduced by the idea of hybrid warfare, even though I'm persuaded by your arguments as I've read them in the past, Oscar. But over to you.
Thank you very much, James. That's a very kind introduction, and good afternoon and good morning to friends and colleagues. I'm going to try to be succinct and trying to say something that's a little bit provocative. Kind of the key idea of what I'm trying to say is that, I mean, especially since 2014, we've seen that Russian strategists found this magic place, which is a gray zone that exists between war and peace. And by exploiting this magic place, Russian strategists has managed to find a lot of utility in its confrontation with the West. This is not seeking to contribute to all the endless conceptual discussions that this field has had, especially the last 8 years, but rather the two key components out of this gray zone is ambiguity and legality, out of the idea that we in the West have a hard time legally addressing these types of actions. And that has also been sold as a fundamental innovation by Russian warfare and Russian approach to the West. And one of the reasons why I don't think what I think this is unhelpful is if you look at the actual start of it on the annexation of Crimea, you have Russian special forces, intelligence officers, VDV taking Crimea, taking off their tags. That is not ambiguity in terms of tricking the West and being, haha, who is this? When you see Russian military kit and Russian soldiers. The innovation of that was actually saying that we know that you, the West, you don't want to do anything about this, so we're going to go pretend as if it's not us, and you can play along for a little while, which we in the West did until we had a so-called fait accompli. Another example is, of course, Russian election interference in the 2016 elections. That was neither problem or ambiguity. Obama went straight face-to-face to Putin and said, hey, knock it off, or else. That's a deterrence problem. That was the or else part that didn't work. It wasn't that you didn't know what was going on. I mean, the degree in which US intelligence have insight on Russian gray zone operations is astonishing. I mean, you can look at the sanctions. Individual DRU officers is sanctioned based on the specific software they have developed. This guy developed NotPetya, this one hacked this. And of course, if anyone doubted in this point, and I did write the piece before all of this was known, of course, but US intelligence insights to this particular war and the onset of it was phenomenal. So that's really on the ambiguity part. I don't really see that ambiguity, and we can talk more about attribution in the cyberspace in the Q&A if you want that. But also on the legality part, saying that there's a gray zone between war and peace is based on the conception that war and peace are relevant factors distinguishing our activities today. James, do you know how many times war is mentioned in the UN Charter? 0 is actually wrong. It's mentioned once, but it's mentioned in the preamble. In the preamble, it says the UN Charter is meant to save preceding generations from the scourge of war. But it's mentioned 0 times in the operative paragraphs. So, I mean, the UN Charter says nothing will impair the inherent right of self-defense, inherent, something that predates the UN Charter, which basically means to policymakers, defend your country and then you make a legal argument in advance. It's not that we are sitting and having our hands tied behind our backs because we haven't the legality to defend ourselves. The UN Charter, of course, prohibits against the use of force or threat of use of force as well. And if you talk to a good lawyer, I mean, I know the Swedish legal system very well. I mean, the security police, the armed forces have great opportunities to act in peacetime. And as always, if you feel an imminent threat to your national security, you will act, and then you will settle the legal debates after that. So why is this a problem with the gray zone? Well, the problem is that if you construct, there is this gray zone with the problem, ambiguity, and illegality, well, then you're going to seek to try to fix it by fixing attribution, by fixing forensics, or updating national and international law. But that doesn't solve your problem. The key problem here, I argue, is more than anything, this is about determination and deterrence. And I think that, I mean, I just got off TV commenting on the current speech. This is Putin from a fairly desperate position, not being able to secure what he wants politically through military means, and try to do it by betting on lack of determination from Ukraine and by the US and by the broader West, by saying, it's ours, we'll escalate if you hit it. So that's basically what I want to say now. Looking forward to the discussion. Thanks for that time.
No, thank you very much, Oscar. We'll definitely get back into that. I think it's such a political issue, a thorny political problem, that I think maybe the politics of it we need to get into. Dara, you know what's coming. I see you just appeared on my screen as well. So maybe it's a little bit unfair of me to ask you a question, because we asked you just to commentate, but I just feel I had to do something to lift some weight here and just say, I mean, I assume, Dara, that this is appealing to you in the sense that you believe that these are indeed myths and misconceptions, and they're important. It's important that they are revealed as such and deconstructed, as these authors and the other authors have done. And you probably don't feel in any sense that they are straw men, and it might be true but not necessarily important. But I wonder if you could dig into that a little bit and talk about the importance of these misconceptions that people at very senior positions, decision-making positions, hold about the Russian military, and why this is so essential right now. Not just because of the war in Ukraine, obviously, but because it leads to fundamental mistakes in policy, I presume, and in fact it does affect the way in which this war and future wars will be fought, I presume. So it's a slightly rambling way of saying over to you, Dara.
No, thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to be part of the launch here. I am so glad that this product exists. There is a lot of nuance and debate in a lot of the issues that we follow as a career field. And I think it's important to capture that together in a document. And I think it's important to have it out there. And I think oftentimes many of these issues become compressed or oversimplified to be shared outside of the group of knowledge, whether it be to policymakers or media or just generalists out there, but there is a risk that they get distorted over time. So I'm really glad to see all of these written down. I enjoyed reading all of them. A few years ago, I taught a course at Georgetown University, and it was about the Russian military. And one of the first things we did was have a few slides up that talked about myths. The Gerasimov doctrine is not real. Escalate to de-escalate is not a thing. It is something that rhymes, and therefore very popular. But it's not an accurate representation of Russian nuclear policy. So I'm just glad to have this document here, something that can be shared with students in the future, something that anyone can pick up and read, regardless of their familiarity with these topics. So well done to all the authors for capturing so much in such a condensed and accessible way. It did strike me reading through it that there were some themes that echoed, that these myths can lead to self-limiting behaviors or self-deterrence. If there is a misrepresentation or misunderstanding of Russian red lines or Russian rhetoric, it can result in less effective policy decisions, less effective force postures across the board, really. So I thought that that was an interesting narrative, and I picked up on it the most in terms of Russian nuclear thresholds, Russian escalation management, from what we shall not call the gray zone all the way up to nuclear use. These topics are difficult to understand and relay, but I think you've done an excellent job here. Russian reflexive control, the concept of that is certainly a factor in why there's a lot of misrepresentation and misunderstanding out there. If they just repeat themselves often enough from an official podium, these things are held as truths when maybe in actuality they are not. Another thing that I noticed reading through and just being a practitioner in the field is that sometimes narratives take on a life of their own, whether that was in the 1990s, Russia was beaten and the Cold War is over. Russia is over was a popular tagline during that time period, but that's not how they saw themselves. And as Richard noted, it's a misconception that there was no money flowing into the military. There always was. I think another period of narrative was from the mid-2000s up until this year, potentially, which spans Russian recovery to suddenly Russia as a revisionist power and they're everywhere. So this conception of Russia and this perception of what Russian power is lurches from one extreme to another, from we don't need to worry about them, so they're everywhere and they're unbeatable. I would argue that we're probably entering into another period now in the aftermath of this war in Ukraine. Where do we go from here as a community, and what types of narratives do we need to be on the lookout for? I think we're probably heading into another space where there are oversimplified narratives and myths that are being made right now. Some of those are the Russian military has always been bad and all the experts missed the last 15 years of how bad it was. I think that's an oversimplification. It's based on another myth, which is Russian reforms didn't work. I don't think that's true. I think it's demonstrably false, but there are aspects that proceeded more smoothly than others. And then finally, there's I think a myth about why, or an oversimplification of why things are going so poorly for Russia inside Ukraine. And there's lots we can talk about there, but perhaps for Q&A. But I'm sure you all have experienced this in your career. You put together excellent analysis supported by data and facts, and you present it to the intended audience, and it doesn't go in. The myths continue, whether they're buzzwords or they just continue to exist out there. And I came across this quote many years ago, and it helps me understand this phenomenon. It's a quote by Upton Sinclair. It is difficult to get someone to understand something when their salary depends on not understanding it. So, maybe you all have encountered this where you have a beautiful baby of an analytic product or research report and you present it and it just doesn't work for the policy or for the politics or for the money or other contextual matters at the time. But it's important to keep trying, and it's important to have reports like this out there. I know we're going to lose two of our panelists here in about 10 minutes, so I do have some specific questions for everyone who spoke, but I'll save those and potentially.
I might be needing you for that, Dara. That's great. Thank you very much indeed. And by the way, very briefly on the Upton Sinclair quote, I've been using that myself for years about the corporate sector's seeming indifference to events and Russia's sorry, I've lost you all. You've come back. The corporate sector's love affair with Russia, I suppose, and the dollar signs in front of their eyes. So it's quite funny you mention it there. And maybe I'll come back to you on the other myths you mentioned about Russian military modernization not working and how it's always been bad, because those strike me as being equally as important. Yes, you're absolutely right, though. I think we've only got about 10 minutes of Richard and Valeri, and they seem to have some of the best questions, at least so far. So I'm going to go straight in with it, actually. No hesitation. Actually, the first question from somebody, Hector Perry, super question here, Valeri. going back to the concept of difference in rhetoric and of the difference in rhetoric and nuclear doctrine, is it possible to associate Putin's statement of a new world order as resulting in a change to doctrine? In other words, can we? I mean, yes, there's doctrine and yes, there's rhetoric, but is the rhetoric changing the doctrine? Sorry.
Yes, that's a great question indeed, James. Thank you for that. To me, the reaction to this particular question has been, well, I can liken it to a glass half empty, glass half full simile, so to speak. I'm not particularly sure which kind of glass which is, but let me say that, yes, it can be what Putin said about the use of all available means for the defense of territorial integrity, presumably including the new regions. That could be taken as a broadening of Russia's military doctrine, but in this particular case, as in others, in fact, I would argue that let's stick to the rules, as it were. To the extent that Russia's nuclear doctrine can be interpreted as a set of rules, let's stick to that rather than run away with this. On this point, it strikes me that quite a lot of Western commentary has, in a way, jumped the gun and they joined the dots where perhaps there shouldn't be. So, yes, in the same passage, Putin spoke about some sort of nuclear windrose or some other obscure expression, but he did invoke the word nuclear. In the same passage, he said about the defense of territorial integrity by all available means. But the two do not necessarily equate. By that I mean perhaps that what are these available means if we deconstruct them and take them from what they are and how they are in use at the moment all the way to a nuclear escalation. I think Dara has also mentioned it in her speech. By no means can it be said that Russia has exhausted the escalation steps that potentially are open to it. To me, in fact, Putin's announcement of partial mobilization was a step that was just one of the two, one of several available to him. He could have gone full in or all in on the nuclear threat, such as he may have done, or he could have gone for a softer option, as the case may be, in particular partial mobilization. It's just one example. It's just one example of the steps available to him before he seriously considers nuclear escalation. It is also important to know that there is such a thing as prestige, honor, considerations of self-perception of Russia as a great power. By no stretch of the imagination can it be argued that Russia would choose nuclear escalation now in the face of Ukraine. Let us consider his decision to invade Ukraine, which many argued was irrational. In fact, it was not really irrational. Had it been irrational, an irrational avenue would have been to go to war against the knowingly superior forces, knowing that no constructive victory is ever possible. Now, that cannot really be said of Ukraine. If you compare the military potentials of Ukraine and Russia, the two did not really compare, at least to begin with. So by no means was it irrational as a move to go to war against Ukraine. The expectation clearly was, right, let's get it done within a week. Well, that didn't happen. We all know what happened, but be that as it may, it was not irrational. By the same token, to argue that nuclear escalation in Ukraine particularly is imminent, now that would have been irrational. That would be irrational in my view, because there are so many other avenues to pursue for Putin, from the outcome of his part mobilization, which he could use, for example, to secure the lines in the south or in the east, and then possibly to push further out to further steps he might have to take. So that would be my answer to the question.
Yeah, very, very, very interesting. And I suppose, though, a lot of people did think, and you may not have been one of them. I'm sure you weren't, Valery, but his decision to go to war was irrational, and therefore that's why I worried about the nuclear threat. But rather than that, I'd actually like to ask Matt Sussex's question, not least because he's in Australia and presumably, he stayed up for us. But it's more important. He says, to what extent, Valery, will Russian conventional losses compel it to rely more extensively on nuclear weapons for deterrence in future? And then, to what extent will NATO view that as credible, considering that Moscow's already ramped up its nuclear rhetoric so many times? And that'll be your lot, and I will release you, Valeri, after that. And obviously, Richard, I'm coming to you afterwards, if I may.
Yes, thank you, James, and the questioner. The question, I think, presupposes the possibility of a broader conflict between Russia and NATO or a NATO power in the future, and that really cannot be taken as read. We do know that Russia positions itself as exclusively defensive, both conventionally and in nuclear terms, and to suppose now that following the debacle in Ukraine, there could be a conflict between Russia and NATO is, I think, a step too far. But to the extent that it remains a theoretical probability, Russia has always chosen to rely for deterrence purposes on its nuclear arsenal. To some extent, it is a sign of weakness, I think, and Russia would be the first to admit that against NATO, its conventional potential is inferior. So to speak about any change between how Russia has always behaved in the nuclear realm and how it will behave in the future is perhaps inappropriate, because nuclear has always been at the center of Russia's notions of deterrence and will remain so. The biggest questions to me arise when I consider Russia's steps to renuclearize, as it were, because yes, it is defensive, yes, its conventional forces have improved, but for reasons that are not entirely clear, it pursues both conventional rearmament and nuclear rearmament in ways that go below the radar, shall we say. We all know about Russia's fearsome strategic nuclear arsenal, but very little is known about Russia's non-strategic nuclear weapons, even though heavy hints are constantly dropped about the dual capabilities of virtually all of the latest Russia's delivery systems, be it Kalibr, the sea-launched missile, or the Iskander, the ground-to-ground weapon, and so forth. So that really is the worry that must be thought about and addressed as a capability gap. Sorry, what was the second element of the question, James, quickly? And
to be honest with you, I've got to move on, so
right,
we shouldn't worry about it right now. It was about NATO, and would NATO believe it? Well, sorry. Yeah, okay, go on. Would NATO believe it?
No, that's fine. That's fine. Let's move on.
Okay, right, Valeri, please. Thank you very much indeed. I know you have to go, but thank you. Richard, is there any chance you could give us 2, 3, 4 minutes of your time?
Yep, sure.
Right, thank you. I apologize because I can see it's 2:58 or 2 minutes to the hour. Listen, there's a few for you here, and I probably about 3, I think, if I may. Let me take the first one because it's complex. It's by Kieran O'Meara, who always asks good questions. Given the nature of the globalized world economy, economic sanctions in response to Russia's invasion have been used by politicians and analysts alike to explain negative economic changes in the domestic sphere across a number of states. So given that, should the current period be a testimony to the end of the claim that complex interdependence is a guarantor of peace and prosperity? Tough question, I thought, but interesting. Do you want me to take them all at once? Would that help you?
Yeah, do that, because I'll write down my
response. You can write them down, and then you can, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, next one is about corruption, and it's very simply, Duff Mitchell's question: could corruption within the Russian military explain the persistent high military budgets? I'll leave it at that. There was more to it. And then finally, an oldie but a goodie. Given the myth that Russian military expenditure is unsustainable, that's not quite what you're saying. It's sort of what I was saying in a way. So not entirely fair. Are sanctions an effective response to war in Ukraine? So that's as I say, an oldie but a goodie. So you've got 3 there.
Okay, thanks, James. And I'll try and answer yours as well. And I'll be very quick on all of them, so
right.
I won't take up too much time. I'll be brief and make a virtue out of the fact that I have to collect the kids. And so first one, is this the end of the claim that trade and increased interdependency means the end of war? I mean, I don't think that ever was really supported by the evidence. World War I took place between Germany and the United Kingdom at what was probably the peak of globalization, at least until relatively recently. So that put paid to that idea, I think. And certainly if we look at what's happened now, Russia, despite the fact that it's not as big as the large in terms of GDP as the US, as China and whatnot, it's still a regional heavyweight, and it was a very open and remains a very open economy. So it was more, it's, you know, if you take the traditional indicator of openness, which is to take your imports and exports as a sum of as a proportion of GDP, Russia was more open than the US, than China, than most larger European states. So for a large economy, it was very open. So it was open, it was interdependent, and yet it chose to go to war. So yeah, I don't think that proposition was ever really supported by the evidence, and it certainly isn't now. Two, corruption in the military budget. I think corruption accounts for a fair old wedge of some of the money that's spent. I always make the case that we should not measure military expenditure in dollar terms, but instead in ruble terms, and if we're going to use an exchange rate, use a purchasing power parity one. And you know, this is an economy that would have been spending anywhere between 150 to 200 billion a year, and yet we've seen all these sorts of capability gaps. We've seen all sorts of problems in training and manning. You know, people not necessarily being there, paper, almost dead souls of the army. And I think that again speaks to the fact that a lot of things were taking place that shouldn't have been taking place, and that wasn't necessarily something the leadership was aware of. Are sanctions an effective policy tool? I mean, James and I have had this discussion for about 8 years, and he knows my thoughts on this, which are they don't necessarily do everything or achieve all the aims that you would want them to, and that's because it's quite complex. The effect that sanctions have on a target are mediated by the nature of that country and that country's political system, and in particular, when you sanction an authoritarian country, they have abilities to mitigate sanctions. However, for us doing it, what's the alternative? You know, in Russia's case, it's a nuclear power, so we have to be more delicate and cautious about how we would respond militarily, and therefore sanctions are the best, I think, of the available means. I just think that very often people perhaps expect too much of them, and I think sometimes politicians can fall in the trap here of when they see the economic indicators pointing south for an economy, and that happened at the beginning of this war. People assume that sanctions are working, in inverted commas, and that that the change in foreign policy on the part of the target is about to come, and that's rarely the case. What they're better at is sapping, I think, the opponent over a longer period of time, reducing the living standards in that country, and possibly contributing towards a reassessment of that country's view of its place in the world. I think that there's an argument that they can help there. And then to your question at the beginning, James, as to sustainability, and let's thinking about it now and how long can it really go on for? I think the key question, as ever with the Russian economy, is it's all to do with the price of oil. And it really is the price of oil, because a lot of people are focusing on gas at the moment. And although gas has gone up as a money spinner in recent months because supplies have been reduced, driving up the price, traditionally it hasn't been the real money spinner for the Russian budget. It's been oil. And oil prices, despite the fact that Russia's selling at a discount, have remained high enough that the Russian government can afford to do most of the things that it wants, at least those priority areas, and that in this case is fighting the war. Also, if we look at stocks and flows, it's got a stock of savings. Despite the fact that some of it was confiscated, there's still a big war chest that it's sitting on, and that's got bigger. So even if the price of oil were to go down as a flow, it still takes some months, possibly a year or two, until we start to see I think the financial pinch possibly result in some sort of reassessment by the Kremlin. So I don't rule out that financial constraints may become a problem. They certainly could, but I think it will be preceded by a decline, a sharp decline, and persistent, sustained decline in the price of oil or the volume of oil. If that can happen, then because Russia is so dependent on that source of revenue, then I think we might see something different. But for as long as it can continue to sell prices at a relatively elevated level and in high volumes, then I think Russia's able to pretty much plod on.
That makes a lot of sense. But although I think we should delve into it maybe a little deeper at some point in a separate roundtable to see on the sustainability of this. But I thank you very much for that. I agree. The price of oil, there's still money there for the time to come. Richard, you too are really. I can see Valerie's still on my screen, and it's 3:05. But you're certainly released. We're grateful. Thanks from all of us. Katarzyna, can I turn to you? I've got a couple of questions on the Arctic.
Sure.
First of all, Christopher W's question, could be Christopher Walker. I know Christopher Walker, maybe it could be somebody else. Asks, how might we understand Russia's militarization of the Arctic? Might we understand it as an expansion of their extended bastion concept that historically has been directed elsewhere? That's one question. Number two, Michael Collins asks, perhaps I think very similar to mine to you actually, Katarzyna, is it sustainable? Is the Arctic position sustainable in view of the war in Ukraine, very simply? seems fair. Over to you.
Right, good question, of course, well justified. And, I will start with the last one. So, the interesting thing about the question is it has been asked during all the period, I've looked at the Arctic, the military modernization was going up and up and up, and people will be, but that it does not make sense. Why does Russia does it? What is the point of it?
Yeah.
And it's a good question, because if you look at the Russian borderlands, the Arctic still remains one of the most stable Russian borderlands. There is, compared, for instance, the Baltic and the Black Sea. So I think that absolutely is justified why Russia would be doing it. Who is actually going to attack Russia in the Arctic? But the reality is that Russia has actually seen that. I mean, Russia does not apply its logic, and does not apply the logic even during all these problems and issues and experiencing in Ukraine. Quite the contrary, actually. So we've seen that both on the doctrinal and political level, there is still a willingness in Moscow to prioritize the Arctic, even in this extremely difficult situation that Russia is in economically and militarily and politically. So, we've seen the maritime doctrine that was outdated in July, basically moved the Arctic at the top of the list of regional priorities. And it was further, repeated or confirmed and corroborated in the rhetoric by Russian authorities, including Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu in August. And on the practical policy level, implementation level, we've seen, for instance, quite significant military exercises taking place in the Arctic, including in August, when we've seen the 10 surface vessels, including the flagship of the Northern Fleet, Piotr Wielki, submarines, air and coastal defenses, even though, again, Russia is basically drowning in Ukraine. So I think that's, and there are several reasons for that. Part is the fact that Russia does prize very, very highly the military bases, the capacities. Of course, the second strike capability is very important. And Russia has quite extensive perception of threat perception in the Arctic, ranging from a missile attack that could come from the United States on Russia, including from the Arctic direction. There is an obsession about possible coming future expansion of both commercial and state actors in the Arctic, including trying to gain more control over Russian energy and other valuable mineral and metals, other resources in the Arctic. So yes, I think despite that it's a logic we would apply Russia, it doesn't seem still not be applying that logic. Of course, we will see how it goes, how it will be moving ahead further as how Russia will be able actually to maintain that activity. But again, I think especially the nuclear dimension remains very important, and that's why also in prolongation the region is very important. And I think it's also very closely Russia does attaches. It seems they are very serious about seeing the Arctic as a kind of assurance for state income in the future. This, of course, primarily includes energy resources, but not only. Of course, the Russian foreign policies have been hurting the Russian extensive economic ambitions, starting, from the annexation of Crimea, sanctions. A number of projects, exploration projects, have been postponed in the Arctic because Russia is dependent on Western know-how, technology, investment in order to move, especially offshore, because that's something that Russia has really prized. They are doing relatively well onshore, but that's not what the biggest ambitions are about. As for the second question, whether we can see it as an extended bastion concept, I think it is a part of it. It's not all of it. I think that's the major focus. So basically, Russia has continued to rely on the Cold War bastion defense, which is basically several layers of defenses, including different capabilities in the region, in order to protect, defend the capacities, in particular the SSBNs, of course, and other nuclear assets, but not only, in the region operational area, provide the strategic submarines a freedom of movement of operation, especially in crisis and conflict situations. And we've seen the bastion defense being deployed under exercises on a number of occasions. So I think this is a part of it. And as I mentioned in my introductory remarks, indeed, major focus of the Russian military activity is still on that part of the region, so the Western or European part of the Arctic. But then we see that there are several layers of that military activity. In the central, Russia has been moving to the central and eastern part of the Arctic, expanding not only the air activity, which has been quite significant along the northern sea route, so the maritime corridor along the Siberian coast, but also the naval, actually surface naval operations have also been expanding. And this is related to, this is not bastion defense, this is related to a more long-term thinking about the Arctic and about what kind of challenges and threats Russia may encounter in the future, especially as they expect the human presence, both civilian and military in the region, will expand in the future, and therefore, and that has been an argument that Russia has used since early stages of that expansion, so 2008 in particular. Therefore, Russia has to strengthen its military positions, foothold in the region before everybody else, or else Russia will be driven away by the region, from the region by other actors. So yes, I guess so this is a part of it, but again, it's actually much more complex. The spectrum of threats and security challenges that Russia is preparing for in the Arctic is quite complex and extensive.
Absolutely, it is. Thank you very much indeed, Katarzyna. Much appreciated. I'm going to move on to, I'm going to leapfrog Alexander whilst I hope desperately for a question on Suwałki Gap, and go to you, Oscar, for a second. I'll try and come back to you, Alexander. I'm sure I will. But I've got a couple for you, Oscar, if I may. One by Seong Jun says, I didn't know this myself. Anonymous Russia claims today it took down the MI5 website. I hadn't read that, but so may well not be true. And the Ukrainian services site, Ukrainian security services site on Wednesday. So he's asking, is there much significance military to these DDoS attacks, the denial of service attacks, I suppose? That is one. And then if you've got a note of that, maybe there's one more for you. Russian military operations in Chechnya, Syria, and Ukraine have relied on overwhelming force and deliberate targeting of and brutalization of non-combatant populations. So where does this brutal approach to war come from? Because I know you're sort of a military historian as well, in terms of its history and military experience. Is it simply ruthless pragmatism, or is something else going on here? Wow, quite a question. Okay, two for you, Oscar, if I may.
Thank you very much, James. And I'll be so cheeky as well to tie into another point that really struck me where Dara started. She was teaching these myths. And among other things, I worked for a couple of years at the Swedish Joint Staff. And I think there's one reason why these myths are proliferating is it because it fulfills a functional need in the bureaucracy. I mean, people who are not area studies expert needs to understand how Russian warfare works, where you grab a concept such as the Gerasimov doctrine, and then you look at the chart, some sort of escalation, military, non-military means. It becomes a false familiarity of being, hey, I've seen it, I have an idea of, hey, here's a bunch of different means, and it becomes a shorthand for knowledge. And I think that sadly, I think it's hard to eradicate that. I think our field is full of them, whether it's A2AD or escalate, whatever that rhymes. It fulfills a very functional purpose in the bureaucracy. Secondly, I would also be so cheeky to comment on another point, because I saw there was a lot of questions on what war is and what would amount to war, nuclear war. And I didn't spell it out the first time, and that's my fault. But I think what's important to remember is that war is a political act. It's not a legal factum that policymakers will sit and be like, okay, well, this box is ticked, so this is not ticked. So what will trigger Article 5, what would trigger Western response to nuclear war? It's all in the heads of policymakers and the judgment calls that they are making of the situation and how to handle it. And there's no binary answer being, well, this will amount to Article 5 or not. It's dependent on the actors how to interpret it. So now to answer the questions. Yes, it is a longstanding, coherent pattern of Russian military operations to rely on overwhelming force, including brutalization of civilians. And I think that, one of the things which is more clear now that to most people than it was before the start of the war in Ukraine is the Russian armed forces are to a large degree about concentrating massive fires, and it's primarily through artillery and also I mean, using the Air Force a lot as flying artillery more than what we kind of assume or think that, you know, as Western do a lot of suppression of enemy air defenses and that kind of stuff. So yes, no, I can only note that that holds long-term coherence together with a number of other things as well, not caring that much about losing lives of civilians, losing lives of your own soldiers. And I mean, the mobilization and even the direct transmission of mobilized soldiers without any training just underlines this, including the orders not to retreat from Liman, which is being encircled in this very moment. When it comes to Anonymous Russia and MI5 websites, the DDoS, I think the short answer is that they're mostly useless. I mean, this was the case. What would Russia do to Sweden and Finland's NATO accession? And you know, some governmental pages was DDoSed, and that's incredibly sad for researchers who sit and trying to find a defense bill because they want to read it. But in terms of, you know, disturbing anything and having a strategic impact on society, DDoSing MI5's webpage. I mean, when was the last time you were in MI5's webpage? That's a very different thing from internal databases that needs to keep the agency running. So no, is the short answer to that one. And yeah, I'll stop there.
I apologize. So I'm going to defer on you for a second, Alexander, and go straight to Dara. Dara, I was enticed by your other myths, as I said, and I wondered if I could ask you to actually go into what may seem important in the context of this topic, in the context of this discussion, that the Russian military has always been bad. You said it's an oversimplification. I was told the other day that you mustn't mistake a bad plan for a bad army, which I think is probably a variation of what you're saying, perhaps in the context of this war. So I wondered if you could go into that and the fact that military modernization didn't work, because again, it's counterintuitive. It looks like it didn't because they're doing so badly at the moment. But of course, we know about the reforms, the Serdyukov reforms in particular, about what they learned from the Georgia War in 2008. And so it seemed like they did, and yet well, maybe you could go into that for us.
Sure. Yes, I've seen it out there bandied about that you know, the reforms were incomplete. The Russian military never changed. It's still Soviet in terms of its thinking and its planning. And I do think there's probably some elements of the Soviet aspect that are going on inside the halls of the general staff that led them to this place in Ukraine. I do think there was some pretty bad planning assumptions built into this. But if we're going to tackle the question of why are outcomes so poor for the Russians based on some pre-war assumptions, I think it's important to differentiate the different things going on here. There's something inherently difficult about invading a country the size of Ukraine with air defenses, with an air force, even though it's much smaller than the Russians. There's something very difficult about maintaining this level of intensity of conflict for months on end. That is difficult to do. Not many militaries can do that. Two, there's a whole set of issues that are endemic to the Russian military that got them to this place. With respect to reform, I don't think it was the equipment that brought Russia here to where they are now. They actually did procure equipment. It was good. It is on paper better in many ways than what they're facing inside Ukraine, with a few exceptions. But where I think reforms did not get as far as initially planned 10 years ago was regarding the personnel. How do you train these people? How do you treat them as professionals? How do you fix the problems in your culture, your military culture, to move forward to a different model? Those things were all started. They were maybe 2 or 3 years into some of those programs. And then with the new leadership change with Shoigu and Gerasimov, a lot of them were left to wither and go away. And there was a status quo of stability and not discussing problems. And when you paper over problems like this year after year after year, you have unpredictable results on the battlefield. So, you know, I think that the narrative that's maybe springing up, how was all of this missed? Not all of it was missed, but you know, there's a difference between predicting secrets, trying to figure out secrets, and then there's a difference between mysteries. And it is a mystery why the Russian high command did not inform many of their soldiers that they would be fighting in Ukraine until the days prior to the war. That's a mystery. I mean, there's reasons we can speculate on why. Maybe stability was more important than winning. Who knows? But there's just a lot going on. I don't know if I've answered your question, but I do think that we are in the midst of a new phase of myth making about the Russian military. So we have maybe volume 2 for this report.
Absolutely, for sure. You're in it. You're hired. Thank you very much indeed, Dara. If I don't come back to you again, maybe I will. But thank you very much indeed, Alexander. Maybe I could just riff off something that Dara was just saying to ask you maybe a final question. I mean, we've got a little time left, but we'll see. Because Dara mentioned something at the beginning about being something very difficult, intrinsically difficult about invading a country the size of Ukraine. I mean, with 45 million people, largest country in Europe, it does seem as if they chose one of the more difficult options. You know, I mean, obviously in some countries you've got to get through other countries. They don't share a land border of Russia. You know, Armenia doesn't, for example, either. So it would be harder, even if there's a color revolution in Armenia, for them to get through. One assumes. Central Asia maybe a more difficult prospect in some respects because of a larger landmass there and the more difficult terrain and conditions potentially, and force positions. So I suppose my question to you is, and it's not really related to the Suwałki Gap other than the fact that you're a military operations specialist, is what could have been easier for the Russians? Do you agree with Dara's basic premise that Ukraine was particularly difficult? Why was it so difficult? What might be easier in the event of a Russian success? They might have dreams elsewhere, or in the event of a Russian failure, and they might decide to do something easier. Is that a reasonable question for you?
I think so. And indeed, when I was listening to her remarks, I was reminded of what my friend said of his time in Iraq. He was in the US Marine Corps and he fought on the first wave of Baghdad. And so when we were watching, aghast, with all those columns of Russian armor moving down the main roads in various directions, bunched together as it were, the commentary, one that I articulated at the time, was that this is crazy because you need to disperse those forces, and clearly they're providing a very target-rich environment. But he said that they more or less did the same thing in Iraq, that they had these columns of armored vehicles moving into the country fairly close together, with all sorts of breakdowns happening as a result. The difference, of course, is that they were fighting Saddam's army, one that has been considerably weakened by sanctions. There was indeed a no-fly zone, so issues of air defenses were not necessarily present there, and so, at least for certain parts of the country. And so the United States more or less did some of the same, had some of the same tactics in going about the invasion of Iraq as the Russians did earlier this year, but vastly different outcomes, precisely because of the nature of the enemy. And some of the terrain, of course, matters here too, but I think we have to acknowledge those similarities to come up with a perhaps slightly fairer assessment. I still think Russian tactics, techniques, and procedures have been pretty bad all throughout. But I do think that at the end of the day, the overarching campaign was badly premised on certain bad assumptions. And on the eve of the invasion or re-invasion, my thought was that Russia would more or less concentrate on its artillery advantages in the east to try to break out of the Donbass, to wear down Ukrainian lines, and then move towards the west while using those battalion tactical groups in the north to fix possible Ukrainian reinforcements in a position. But they decided to go all in various directions all at once without any clear central authority. I think that was indeed one key mystery: who was in command of the entire operation. And it turns out that no one was, that just regional commanders were doing their own thing. So I think there is an alternative universe out there where these sorts of assumptions were not incorporated into the actual military strategy, that there was some sort of unified command structure that could go about the campaign in a more intelligent manner. But alas, thankfully for us, and especially for Ukraine, we're not in that alternative universe.
Indeed not. Thanks very much indeed. Much appreciated, and thanks for expanding upon your topic there as well, Alexander. There's four speakers left. There's about 5 minutes left. I'm going to ask you all the same question, one final question each, the same question. We can go in reverse order, but it's very simply this: if there was one thing Katarzyna, Dara, Alexander, and Oscar, that you wish that policymakers would understand or not misunderstand about the Russian military? What would it be? Because just, I mean, so you've only got one chance here. You've got 5 minutes with your foreign secretary or with your head of state. What's the one thing that you wish that they would really not get wrong? So shall I go in reverse order and maybe Dara first, perhaps? Unfair.
Oh no, I'm first. I guess the one thing that I've always wished, seeing policy go through different attitudes about Russia over the last 15 years or so, Russia is never as weak as it seems, and it's never as strong as it seems. And I say that because I feel like the people who watch it stay in one place, but the world around us kind of is on a seesaw. But yeah, that would be my recommendation. It's never as strong or as weak as it seems.
Excellent. So Oscar, maybe I'm not thinking it's any order at all. Oscar, anyway.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, war is a battle of wills, and this is driving home the thing of determination. And I think that Russia's got a lot of utility by escalating towards a hesitant West, and most of the time getting away with it, but many times when they get called, they back down. So,
good one, Katarzyna.
I don't know. I guess one of the kind of common theme through all this contributions to the report has been basically saying pay attention to complexity and precision, because unfortunately it's very inconvenient, especially to politicians. but I guess this is what we are trying to say, that this is a very complex topic, including the war in Ukraine. I mean, some of the arguments about why all went so wrong has been voiced here, including the fact that, you know, there are circumstantial problems and there are this, you know, long-standing problems we have observed over many years. So that I think I would try to pay them attention to that.
Absolutely. Alexander, your one thing?
I would say, I would echo, first of all, what everyone else has said so far, but I would also add that as regards to Russia's nuclear threats, I would say pay attention not to Putin's mouth, but to Russian nuclear deployments, operations, and readiness levels. And if you look at those things instead, you'll be a little more optimistic about things.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. So don't listen to the rhetoric, look at the deployment, pay attention to complexity, not nuance. It's a battle of wills. Don't be hesitant, and it's not as strong or as weak. Russia is not as strong or as weak as it seems. Thank you very much. Those are good ones to end on. Ladies and gents, thank you very much indeed. We're at an hour and a half. Thanks especially to the 4 survivors and the 2 other speakers of this launch of the paper on Russian military myths. Thank you especially, I must say, to Keir Giles, who helped me prep for this particular webinar. He's probably out there somewhere, and his book Russia's War on Everybody, I think, is out in November, if I'm not mistaken, and presumably you can Google it and find it for Amazon right now, but it's very germane to this particular topic as well. It just remains for me to say thank you, goodbye, and we will be back soon. There is so much more to do between now and the end of the year. Plenty more in store, and again, thank you everybody. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Melania, too. All the best. Bye-bye.